seems like a lot of young men are quite unhappy today. Why do you think that is?
I can sort of reframe this question a little bit and frame it in the sense of why would they be happy? The main advantage of psychology as a discipline is applying the scientific method to. I saw the fundamental problem of politics being that you need to have a.
On the podcast today, a man known for his journalism, presenting, association with the Lotus Eaters, strong background in psychology, interest in everything from cats to camping. Josh Ferme, welcome.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me, Mark.
Oh, super welcome. Love what you've been doing at the Lotus Eaters. I know you're not with them full time anymore, but still occasionally there. And yeah, you were sort of often their kind of psychologist on the board. So I particularly pricked my ears up when you were speaking and giving your opinions on things.
Well, thank you
What,
very
why don't
much.
well, why don't we dive in? It seems like a lot of young men are quite unhappy today. Why do you think that is?
I can sort of reframe this question a little bit and frame it in the sense of why would they be happy? Um, the state of the world as it is, I think men disproportionately get their life satisfaction by feeling like they are moving forward in a career and accumulating resources. And I'm going to appeal to a bit of evidence that might seem a bit counterintuitive, but you only need to look at the video games men and women play to look at the fact that men have this innate desire to want to accumulate resources. And of course, from an evolutionary psychological perspective, that makes perfect sense because in more traditional societies, the man was the provider, particularly hunter-gatherer societies. And so it makes sense that we have this deeply embedded impulse within us. And the economy is not going very well. And in society, despite being disproportionate contributors in terms of financially, they're less likely to take money from the system and most likely to contribute to it. So on the net, they are the most likely to contribute. Um, they're quite often discriminated against in terms of legislation. So there are many pieces of legislation in both the United States and in Europe that favours women over men, and it makes fair competition a bit more difficult. And I think people are particularly feeling this. And I'm not against women in the workplace, but I think that it has to be done in a fair way, whereby people are judged on their merit rather than, you know, chance of birth. And I think that that's a part of it, as well as the fact that I don't think people really realize that it's only relatively recently in human history that we've been without, you know, that much material hardship. People don't really go hungry. I think in most of the Western world, obesity is more of a problem than going hungry. People have a roof over their heads. You know, it might be a rented roof rather than an owned roof, but you know, that's still something. We have our base needs met, and now, for the first time, we're forced to sit and contemplate about ourselves, our role in the world. And I think that ruminating and spending too long idle and thinking about things is a recipe for a sort of downward spiral. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't think about your place in the world, quite the opposite. I'd be a massive hypocrite if I said that, the amount of philosophy I've read. But I think that the conditions of the world as well don't help in the sense of there isn't that much optimism for the future. That many of these things are true of lots of people. And I don't think everything has to be male specific, but I think that the world is slightly more set up to benefit women at the minute in the West specifically. In the developed countries, obviously, other
Right.
parts of the world, that's definitely not true. I certainly wouldn't say that. Um, but I think that there aren't many people willing to play a sort of societal father figure role as well. That's why I think many people were drawn to Jordan Peterson, is that he sort of put young men on a path towards, listen, there's no one out to help you. You need to make something of yourself. And that's something that I think all men need to hear. And I think for many people, it comes too late that they think they're treated equally or fairly to others when actually, you know, You get people like Hillary Clinton, who says the main victims of war are women because they've got to live with the consequences. And of course, that ignores the fact that it's the men dying in the war itself. And there's this sort of culture of insensitivity to our problems. And it's not sort of woe is me, because I think
Mhm.
by disposition, we're more likely to say, well, our problems are what they are. We just need to get on with it. So it's sort of a difficult problem because, on the one hand, I can see an argument for saying, well, maybe people need to be a little bit more sympathetic and that men are human beings as well and deserve some consideration. But on the other hand, it also feels a bit awkward when people do that. So I
Yeah.
think we're at a point in society now where we're in a strange transitional state, both in terms of the economy as well as socially, in that lots of things are very new. We haven't really adapted to it. As a time of uncertainty, time of hardship, and I think that this affects everyone, but I think it's disproportionately affecting men.
Fantastic multi-factor answer. I mean, any complex question always has these different elements to it. Maybe let's pick apart some of these now. So you talked about the economics, that might be there, the very literal discrimination that men face in the US and in the UK, for example, the BBC, the civil service, the police, they have clear hiring guidelines, which is not subtle or in any way paranoid. The guidelines are there in terms of employment. And as you say, young men definitely need a sense of purpose and meaning. Maybe, as you say, Jordan Peterson also spoke to that sense of meaning. So maybe you could speak a little bit more about the meaning crisis, as John Vervaeke calls it, and how young men particularly feel like, what's the point? That's the sense I get from them.
Well, I've got a bit of a controversial opinion on this. I would say there isn't really any point, yeah, objectively speaking. Like if you're looking from the perspective of the universe is indifferent to the suffering of any organism. However, in many ways, this is the most desirable scenario because this allows us to find our life's purpose for ourselves. It's much better to be able to choose it and feel like it fits you than have something ordained for you that you feel like might not be right for you. And in my life experience, and I imagine this is probably true for a large number of people, it's helping other people. It's doing good to your family and friends and your community and doing things that are not self-serving. That's what gives me meaning. I don't know whether that works for everyone, but I have spoke to many other men who feel the same way. And I think that this is a manifestation of the instincts of providing for one's family, but it doesn't necessarily have to be restricted to that. It can be one's friends, one's community, and people that basically matter to you. And I think that there's no better way to, feel like you've done a good day's work than going out of your way to do something to help someone you love.
So an interesting mix of sort of existentialism and traditional values there. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of psychologists aren't in tune with traditional values. So Peterson was the first one I've heard of. There's a guy called Adam Lane Smith, who's a friend of mine who I also follow online. He's fantastic. But they're the sort of only two well-known ones I can mention. Psychologists with a slightly more conservative frame that maybe take into account the importance of extended relationships, as you were speaking to there, being in service to a wider community, a sense of belonging. These things seem critical to well-being, yet they're often ignored by what is a fairly well, very left orientated field. So any thoughts on that bias within the psychological world?
Of course. And I think that the problem here is that there's a view of human nature. I think this is what the fundamental level where it goes wrong is that you've got to have an understanding of human nature. And because I'm sort of obsessed with pre-agricultural human civilization, I suppose you can call it in inverted commas, that way of being seems like the way in which we have evolved to exist, and therefore it seems like the way our unconscious mind has been programmed. And because I think that the conscious mind is the junior partner in the relationship between the unconscious and the conscious mind, I use the analogy of consciousness, and the conscious mind is like a jockey riding a horse. Sure, it can have some control over the unconscious mind, but ultimately, if the horse doesn't want to do something, it can resist the rider. And, if it's not in the horse's nature to do that. And I think that there are many things that our past has entrenched in us that we would do well to acknowledge, because there's this view on the political left that we can change human nature, and to some extent that's desirable. Some people would argue, I wouldn't necessarily, that it's human nature to be selfish. And I think that if that is in your nature, I would implore people to avoid it, right? Because I think it's corrosive to civilization and society at large. And there are many other things that I think that we should try and avoid, but there are some things that are so deeply set into human beings, things like, especially relating to family, because of course the goal of all life is to propagate one's genes, and so the thoughts and behaviors around family are probably going to be the deepest seated, because they hinge most on the survival of a species. This is true outside of humanity as well, and there's no reason to believe that we're any different necessarily. And I think that they're missing this because they believe that you can change human nature in its entirety. And I think this is best epitomized by the work of Karl Marx, where he tries to basically invent a new human being to have a new nature. And I've had interactions with people, sort of Marxist types, who truly believe that there's not such a thing as human nature that is based on biology, but it's just history and environment. And I've had the exact quotes quoted at me from Marx. I'm just like, yes, I've read that. I know what that means, and it's a load of rubbish. And of course, it's not. How do you explain
Mhm.
this enormous body of psychological research that shows people generally behave in very similar ways? And the bitter irony is that many left wing political figures talk about how people are more similar than they are different, but then they ignore the human nature literature that is probably the best demonstration of that.
Right. And I remember at university doing psychology, they said, the nature nurture debate, and maybe it's 50-50 and it depends on the issue, but clearly it's a certain amount of both nature and nurture, and some issues a bit more one way or the other. And it was just sort of obvious, and the data pointed out that we do have a human nature, and we're not sort of tabula rasas, where, that's just absolutely established in terms of the data and the evidence. Yeah, a lot of public policy acts as if it wasn't the case at all.
And in fact, the main reason I actually chose to study psychology, because I very nearly studied joint honours history and politics. And obviously, I've not shied away from those interests either. But the reason I chose psychology, not only because I was more interested in it in general, was that I saw the fundamental problem of politics being that you need to have a decent understanding of human nature to be able to formulate public policy to reflect the humans you're meant to be governing. And if you don't have that, then you're stumbling around in the dark. And so it seemed like a more important problem to solve than the one further down the line. And
Is upstream, isn't it? That like, well,
mhm.
what are our tendencies? What is our nature? I remember years ago, I had an argument with a lefty friend. I said, look, come on, give us some ground here. What does the right do? What do you like about the right? And he sort of begrudgingly said, well, they seem to have a more realistic view of human nature. And I thought, well, doesn't it all start there? I mean, that's the sort of basis of everything, isn't it? Surely. But someone on X asked me to ask you why you chose a more feminine discipline, was how they put it. So psychology is, I think both of our universities are about 80% women on our courses.
Mhm.
I think it's more than that now. If you were to do it today, I think it's more like 90% in British universities. So do you think there's also a feminization of psychology and the view of human nature? Based on those kind of numbers.
Well, the funny thing is that the further you go through psychology, the more the percentage corrects. So you go and do a master's degree and it becomes more male. Then you do a doctorate, it becomes more male again. And then you go on to be a university professor. And although I imagine the hiring has shifted it slightly, but it used to be the case that it'd be more male again. And I went into psychology with a very male brained way of thinking, like, I'm going to be a scientist. I'm interested in the numerical data and the research. I don't really, one of the things that I really hated was the sort of wishy-washy, like, I'm just here to understand other people. And obviously that's still important. But I felt like the main advantage of psychology as a discipline is applying the scientific method to human beings and approaching it objectively as a truth searching mission. And I didn't really, it was a secondary thing that, I wanted to go out and understand other people because I also found that you don't really need to, go to university and formally study these things. Human beings have an intuitive sense of one another, and you shouldn't be reading textbooks to understand how to,
Yeah, literature, travel,
interact.
friendships. There's lots of good ways to sort of understand human beings without having
Hmm.
to just on that kind of level. But I was surprised how much statistics there was in my psychology degree. And I know you've sort of become a little bit famous for sort of sharing uncomfortable facts. So what are some uncomfortable facts you've shared, released into the world, into the wild, or some that kind of, the average left-leaning psychologist wouldn't necessarily want to be known?
You're gonna get me and yourself in trouble for this now, but
Uh,
I've because I like reading research and because I've got this data background, I did a master's in psychological research methodology, which was about 50% statistics, and it was, how to read research papers critically. And so I've got that background. And I thought, well, one thing that's done really poorly in the political world is sort of data analysis and statistics. And so I took it upon myself to go out and answer some of the controversial questions because it's sort of this desire to know the true things about the world, which is why I'm inclined to share them. Because by disposition, I don't like upsetting people. Generally speaking, if someone's upset, it upsets me, even if they're hostile to me politically. It's just how I don't know whether it's how I'm raised or just my disposition, but I'll give you some of these facts. So I think one of them was talking about Pakistani cousin marriage and how the rates of birth defects make them 37% overrepresented. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. Another one was looking at crime data in London, and it was that black Londoners were 13% of the population. I think it was 61% of knife murders and 63% of gun crime. So obviously, to be that overrepresented, there's something going on there. And, I'm not going to necessarily say I know definitively what that is, but part of solving it is identifying there's a problem. And the funny thing is, when I first posted that, there are many people in London who were black themselves, like, thank you for drawing attention to this. This actually means we can take this seriously. And that's a healthier reaction to these sorts of things. I don't want people just to think that I'm, doing these sorts of things to stir the pot and cause trouble because I see problems in the world and I want to solve them. And, I think that that's sort of going back to one of the questions you asked earlier. That is one of the things that gives me purpose is that I am willing to look at the world and speak these uncomfortable truths, even though I don't necessarily want to dispositionally, but because I see it's important and because very few people are actually doing it, it gives me a sense of meaning because it means that these things aren't going to be overlooked and are less likely to continue in the future.
Yeah, facts are the beginning of solving any problem. Reality is the basis of any solution. And it's interesting, we both felt a little bit nervous, I think, there, kind of going in. And, it's literally just a question about facts. You're answering about facts and data. We're not giving prejudicial opinions even about it or, causes of this or roots of that. And we are in a very odd climate now where even facts start to feel a little bit dangerous.
I think people understand that we live in a time where we don't have true freedom of speech. And so people have to talk in a veiled way about controversial issues. But when you present a fact, these facts, I never make a point of analyzing them. I just share the data, what the research says, and nothing else. And I leave it up to everyone else to, do the interpreting because I feel like that's sort of my obligation as a researcher and a psychologist, not to necessarily try and color it with something that it didn't initially have in the data. But I think that because there is this lack of free speech in the absolute sense, people suspect that you're using veiled methods and quite often read into what you're doing as being more hostile. It's sort of like a mirror in a way that I'll post something and then people will see what they want to see in it, even though my intention was I've read these interesting studies. I'm going to share the facts to dispel them wider, and it doesn't really go too much more than that. It's as you can see from my YouTube videos, I've got a variety
Right,
of
it's about
disparate.
camping and cats
Yeah.
and all sorts of things. I mean, sometimes I feel the internet is one big sort of ink blot test that people
Mhm.
just project upon. It's wild out there, right? How did you sort of psychologically, personally deal with being in that environment? So I'm on the edge of it. I'm not sort of hardcore political, but I'm also had cancellation attempts. I've been outspoken about different topics in my field of sort of embodiment and coaching. There's, again, it's very left leaning. Um, and I find it difficult sometimes. I'm a fairly disagreeable person. Like you, I don't like to upset people because I have empathy, but equally, I'm probably more committed to truth than to other people's feelings. It's a higher value to me. But it's tricky, and sometimes I go, you know what? I just got to keep my mouth shut. I don't want to talk about this, and I certainly wouldn't want to be in the sort of daily news cycle like the Lotus Eaters, where we're almost you guys almost every day looking at the Charlie Kirk thing or whatever it is that's kicking off that day. How do you deal with that psychologically without going just completely nuts?
So yeah, I spent a long time in the trenches, almost 5 years of covering the daily news week in, week out. And it's not so much the reaction to it that gets to you, I don't think. Because I worked hard to understand what I was trying to understand and communicated it honestly and with the best intentions, I didn't feel too bad about it if people push back and was like, well, I've done everything in my power to do the right thing here. And I've spoke my mind about problems where I don't necessarily benefit from that directly, but I'm doing it because I want the world to be better. So some people being mean to me on Twitter or what have you isn't really that important in the face of that goal and keeping that in mind. But the thing that does get to you and slowly creeps up to you covering the news cycle over and over again is that it alters your sort of not only your sense of threat, you have this ever present sense of impending doom because you read about the worst of humanity constantly. This is something that I spoke to people in other professions in as well, particularly police officers have this
Yes.
same exact thing where they see the worst of humanity day in, day out, and they become very, very cynical about the future, very, very cynical about their prospects. And this does get to you. You can't help
Mm,
it not getting to you. And one thing that I found is very important, and part of the reason that I've pulled back a bit and have a non-political YouTube channel and do lots of things outside of that is that you need to be balanced and well-rounded. And I've always had this view from quite an early age. I think I can thank my parents for this, that they always hammered home that just being interested in one thing isn't good enough. You need to be interested in everything because it's all interconnected. And you might be surprised that an analogy in geology helps you understand, you know, something in sociology, or, for example, that even if there's no direct link, even the sort of symbolic meaning of something can be used elsewhere. And so there's always something to learn in all areas of life, and it's always quite surprising where it applies. And so this makes it exciting. I really enjoy learning new things. I go out of my way to do it and gaining new skills, and that's, I think, very, very important.
the 5 years of staring into the abyss, it's probably time to go talk about camping a little bit. Um, so why don't we shift to that? So as I understand it, wild camping is one of your hobbies. It's where you kind of go
Hmm.
outside into nature. I'm a big fan of what I call eco-regulation. So the nervous system is soothed by being in nature. There's various sort of psychologists that look at ecotherapy, for example. I always choose to live either by the sea or next to a park, so just out the side, I've got the ocean there. And, at the end of a long day, I'll walk along by the ocean. I'll be coaching someone in Ukraine, going through sort of awful experiences. And I can feel the kind of sea just soothing it. It sounds like for you, it's the woodland. Is that your sort of particular environment of choice when camping, or do you
I
have?
think that woodlands in particular have something about them that I sort of understand it as some sort of ancestrally coded preference, because my understanding of natural beauty is we perceive natural beauty as a proxy for a sort of bountiful environment that's best for us to
Mhm.
survive. Like, if you were to ask someone to draw the most beautiful scene they possibly could, there are consistencies between these things, and I have great fun going through art galleries looking at this. There'll be a body of water, there'll be trees, there'll be animals, and it basically amounts to what sort of environment is most easy to survive in, I guess. And so this sort of sets you at ease by default, I think. But I grew up not too far away from Dartmoor National Park, and growing up in Devon, it was always relatively close because it's almost a majority of the county is slap bang in the middle, and that's where you're allowed to wild camp. And so a lot of my time was spent out there, out in the wilderness, exploring and sort of pushing boundaries. And all the things I delve into that video in have been many years in the making, sort of understanding it. But I think it's very, very important that you spend time in actual wilderness. And one thing that I've always been a big supporter of is having untouched nature, because unfortunately, if you sort of build up an eye for the natural world, you can see the fingerprints of man, even in places like the New Forest, which are,
Mhm.
1,000 years old. Like, I can notice things that are out of place. I'm just like, that shouldn't be there. All this doesn't seem that natural. And of course, it's still managed to a certain extent, but even the more wild parts aren't properly wild. And I think that that's something that we need more of, because there's an aesthetic to that sort of environment that I think maximizes this benefit from spending time in the natural world. And of course, you've got the physical exercise component of it, which is very useful. And if you're lugging around a heavy bag and seeing all of these beautiful places, it's probably the easiest way to do hard exercise, because
Mhm.
I went to Dartmoor a couple of weeks ago. It was incredibly windy, windy enough to the point where if you turned to the wind and tried to breathe, it would take your breath away, that windy.
Right.
And I had a very heavy bag. It must have been about 30 kilograms. And it's a very hilly, rough terrain. It's where the SAS train. And so it's very specialized. But because there was no one around for about 10 miles in any direction, it was lovely, tours everywhere, and hills, grasslands, wild horses. I didn't mind it. And what ended up happening is, in one day, I was doing about 50 to 70 stories in elevation with that heavy bag on, and about 10 miles over the course of 3 days. That all adds up. That's tremendously good exercise. And although when you come home, having a hot shower is phenomenal and you're exhausted, the benefits of that exercise last for a very long time, as well as the sort of psychological benefits of just being in a place with a slower pace of life.
Sort of multiple aspects, the psychological benefit, I think, right? Some is that evolutionary, like this is a a beautiful place. I think maybe there's a spiritual element to that that goes deeper than that, but certainly that the exercise, as you say, huge psychological benefits, kind of enforced mindfulness. I bet when that wind was in your face, you kind of knew where you were. You weren't somewhere else, right? Like you
Oh,
kind of
absolutely.
you're present in the kind of moment, right? And as you say, the slowing down and perhaps the solitude. You've also talked on your channel about the problems with cities, that we're essentially all being driven insane by urban living. Not reproducing seems to be one of the big aspects of that. Some people talk about mouse utopia and how there's this
I
sort
was
of
just about to
pattern.
bring that up. Yeah.
Rudyard, who we had on the podcast, one of the first guests, Rudyard Lynch from What Art Fist, has got a whole series of videos where he talks about a mouse utopia. He's obsessed with it. Yeah, thoughts on urbanization and how it might be sending us all a little bit crazy, particularly in sort of crowded countries like the UK.
I personally loathe it. I grew up on the outskirts of the city of Plymouth in a small village. On one side, I was a short walk away from a beach. On the other, I had farmers' fields, and then an hour's drive away, I had a massive national park. So to to live in a city or even just a densely populated town is torture for me. And I think that to a lesser extent, this is true of other people as well. I think because I had it very good growing up, I'm particularly bitter about not being there anymore. But I think that it's particularly the urban density that's the problem here, in that human beings just are not evolved to live in such dense populations. People who live in more dense populations have elevated levels of cortisol. They're more stressed, obviously, that means. And that is an obvious reaction that you can't override because they're just closer to other people. Other people could be potential threats. So it makes perfect sense to be stressed. You also don't want people not to be stressed because the stress response in this scenario, as you can just see from watching the news, is sometimes warranted and could sometimes save people's lives if there's a dangerous person around. So it makes sense. And I think also when you move out of a city to a more rural area, you have a situation where most of the people around that area know one another. This is certainly the case where I grew up, where people would say hello and stop and have a chat, and people knew each other's names, or at the very least knew roughly where they lived and that they were local, and so could be generally trusting and friendly of them because if there were a problem, well, people would tell one another about it. Whereas in a city, because of the mobility aspect, that doesn't really exist. There isn't really a community. And, sometimes you might get lucky and have a neighbor that you're friendly with that still lives in sort of the old way. And that can be pleasant. And it's not to say there aren't good people in the city, but I think it's less likely. And there are many just hard facts about this. Like if you are looking to do bad things, you have more anonymity in a city because you've got the
Get
safety in
away
the
with it.
crowd.
Yeah, yeah, you
So
can
it's
get away
very
with it.
easy.
Yeah, yeah. And often we talk about co-regulation in psychology. This is sort of the fundamentals of what keeps people sane, what people go to a counselor for, is what your friends do and families do. I wonder also about sort of co-dysregulation. So I'm in a little tourist town in Croatia at the moment, and I'm a migrant. Technically, I'm a sexual refugee because my partner's Italian and doesn't want to live in the UK. So that's where we are for now, anyway, Josh. And I'm surrounded by people speaking German, and I have there's a lot of Germans who sort of live, and I have this sort of ancestral defensiveness that comes up whenever the Germans walk by me. And I'm being fairly comical here just for lightness, but I've also lived in sort of heavily migrant areas of Leeds, for example, where, I was in a white minority in a Pakistani area of Leeds. And I did notice a dysregulation there. And there are studies showing that migrants are quite dysregulated, that they have much higher levels of mental ill health. And I have compassion for that, particularly given where I am now. I have compassion for that situation to be the other. I think it also works the other way. And I don't hear psychologists talking about this, the dysregulatory nature of being surrounded by otherness rather than the sort of norms which signal psychological safety or real safety sometimes, but also the sense of like, yeah, we belong. Like just talking to you, it's like, okay, this guy's got things in common with me. We both grew up in the UK. It's sort of we're vibing, as the kids would say, right? It's fairly as an interview, it's just relaxed. I feel pretty at ease. I'm hoping you do too. So yeah, I'm wondering about the sort of dysregulatory nature of mass migration. So I don't hear it talked about from the other way around.
So my understanding of the opposite of that, just to preface my understanding of what you want me to talk about, is that when people look at people in their own community, they know that they're more likely to think like them, and therefore we understand that there's a certain degree of reciprocity there, that people are more willing to go the extra mile to create a more pleasant environment for you and people within your community. Whereas if everyone is different, you don't know the rules of the game. And I think that what's going on here is that even amongst people who are, pleasant to one another in their own community, they might be a bit colder to people outside of it just because they don't know whether they're community focused. They don't even know how to judge people by looking at them, which, is a bit controversial, but certainly happens. How people are dressed, how they present themselves, just the physical structure of their face determines how people prefer one another. People prefer faces that look like their own because it's a proxy for genetic relatedness, and people who are genetically related are more likely to treat one another with kindness. I think that's a key part of it. But I think that there's a deeper degree of suspicion of one another. I also think that when that gets out of hand, you get the broken window effect, whereby social norms that might have otherwise been upheld even by people, diverse groups of people that have moved to an area and adopted the host culture, well, they don't feel as obligated to do that anymore because there are other people there that are not following these. And I've read research that suggests it only needs to be about 10% of the population not doing something before the rule stops really being seen as an enforced rule
Mhm.
in a social sense. Because social rules, I think, are incredibly important. I'd ideally have a civilization that was mostly governed by these social rules because I think not only are they more fair than arbitrary government ones, but also they're more human, they're more natural, and they accommodate more for circumstances and the nuance of a situation. And
It's high
the,
trust cultures, right? And they don't
exactly, yeah.
require tyranny. So low
Hmm.
trust cultures like what exists in Northern Europe, the UK, and other countries now almost requires a sort of tyrannical hand of the law to enforce laws as opposed to social norms that everyone just gets. And then that's sort of economically and psychologically much more expensive than
Hmm.
a high trust environment where you can just assume givens based on shared values.
Yeah, and there are good examples of the that I think Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, dragged his country to being very successful by being basically very authoritarian because there were large minority populations there. Another example of this is the Michaela Community School, which I think is in London, and I think this is headed by that Catherine Birbalsingh lady who quite often goes on political shows and the like, and she self-describes herself as Britain's strictest headmistress,
Yes, yes, I've come
which
across that. Yeah, yeah.
I had a sort of aesthetic disgust at this because, of course, being the strictest doesn't mean you're the best for those children.
Right.
It's sort of like you're a mini dictator being cruel for the sake of it. That's the connotation I get. And I think that we didn't need to be that strict and that harsh. I don't think it necessarily benefits anyone. It just teaches people how to be crafty to avoid rules and to resent authority, which, when the authority is legitimate, isn't helpful. And I think that the reason that school's been so successful is because of the strictness. But I also think that the problem is the circumstances and not the solution. It's that they have to be strict because it's a disparate group of people. I've seen videos from their schools, and it's a very diverse set of pupils, and that's why they're so strict. And if it were, a group of English students, they could afford to be less strict on certain things. Obviously, depends in what part of the world, what social class, the usual things. I'm not that naive, but I think that these sorts of things are a sort of unintentional casualty of these sorts of problems.
Hmm. So there are a set of conditions which, for young guys today, are quite difficult, whether it be the sort of lack of coherence in the society, the economic factors. Your chances of buying a house in Devon or outside of Plymouth might be a lot less now than your parents, I imagine. Just sort of pure economics, and of course that has to do with supply and demand, numbers of people, being half of that equation at least. And then there's the sort of the lack of alignment with our evolutionary wiring. So, you talked about camping, talked about some of the ways we signal to each other, like, hey, I belong, this is my tribe. We are wired for those things, whatever the communists and the sort of, frankly, lying pseudo psychologists might say. I guess technology is another aspect of that, right? That we're connected. I spent about half an hour on Twitter earlier on X, just kind of researching you. And there's not that much about you on the internet, but there's plenty on X. So I was there looking at what you post and what kind of stuff's he interested in, trying to get a sense here. And after half an hour on X, I was like, my brain had been utterly fried. I'd seen about 10 murders and got 10 kind of assaults. And I just, had this much darker view of the world. Like, I feel like my friend who used to work in forensics and I used to come home and say, what did you do today, Jeffrey? And he'd say, oh, you don't want to know. You don't want to know. You don't want to hear what I did today. I see what I've been looking at all day. And now I'm we're all like in the police, as you said, or the forensics team in my friend's case. Yeah, the sort of impact of technology, and it's easy to be a sort of grumpy old man about this, and so our kids today and their mobile internets. But it does seem like that's part of the psychological damage that's being done. Thoughts on technology?
Of course, I think that there's an algorithmic and financial incentive here, sort of compounding one another in the sense that I think this is prospect theory, isn't it? I should know. I specialized in decision making. A bit embarrassing. I had to even think about it, but potential losses are weighted twice as significant as equivalent gains, meaning that if you lose £1 or gain £1, the loss of the £1 is twice as bad as the gaining one, even though mathematically speaking they should be exactly the same, just in opposite directions. I think that this is an impulse that's deeply seated in human beings, in the sense that we're very we focus a disproportionate amount of our attention to potential threats, potential losses, and things like that. And so this is able to be measured mathematically on many of these social media platforms. And therefore, if they want to maximize attention and therefore the money they generate from ads and the like and clicks, you focus on negativity. And that's an unfortunate reality of it, that angry people click on stuff more.
Mm,
Miserable people are more likely to look up these sorts of things and find out how much worse the world is. And I think that one of the things that we're going to have to be sort of acclimatized to eventually is that this is the reality of the environment. I'm not sure there's much incentive for it to change other than the fact it's probably not good for us. But one way I think that it's helpful to mitigate that damage is by acknowledging the fact that, hey, this is a curated feed that is given to me by an algorithm, essentially. This doesn't necessarily represent real life. This is just what people are saying. And thankfully, I'm cynical enough that I don't believe that just because lots of people are talking about something, that makes it true. And I'm sort of a bit more inoculated against it, I suppose. But you have to consciously mitigate it if you are to use it. And I think social media is very important. And, they're not all the same. I think that, for example, news on other platforms might be a little bit less psychologically damaging. I don't think that the damages of, say, Instagram are equivalent to that of X, where it's all political in that, there's people posting,
different, yeah.
people
For
are
young
post,
women, it's pretty
yeah,
harmful with
body
those.
image
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah, yeah, that's undeniable. But when I go on it, it'll be nice, pretty pictures of sunsets and maybe someone's dinner, which is sort of annoying because I'm just like, who cares? But it's not in the same ballpark as witnessing someone being murdered on X because of the political implications. And also, you have the sort of mass of humanity commenting on it, and it just almost seems unbearable sometimes. But you've got to remind yourself that, hey, this is just on my phone. I can put that down and do something healthy. It's all about having balance in your life and knowing and being self-aware of the impact these sorts of things have on you, acknowledging the fact that this is not necessarily entirely organic, and knowing when to put the phone down or turn the computer off and just do something else, because I think that people get too hooked into repeating these sorts of patterns and cycles, and they're really miserable and they don't understand that, hey, this is something you can change in a day. Just change your behavior a little bit and it can change. And I've said this to many people who've been made miserable by these sorts of things. I'm just like, honestly, it's the easiest thing in the world. You'll feel so much better even after a week. Just do it. Perhaps just don't go on it for a week. Have a little break away from it.
Yeah, take a break from it.
I hear
Yeah.
many, many people in my line of work saying, "Oh, I had a break from going on social media or politics or reading the news, and I feel so much better for it." And this is, almost across the board.
Right,
I've
everyone.
heard this from people. So it must be something that the vast majority of people have to do if they're to engage with these sorts of things healthily, because of course they do have benefits. I find out about a lot of interesting information. I learn a lot about various things. It puts me onto stories that I might want to cover, and that I wouldn't have found out about otherwise. And I can go down a rabbit hole of research thanks to that. So it has lots of benefits, I think. but we shouldn't also get too carried away by it.
Yeah, I was trying to look out the window. Go, okay, it's quite nice here. There's still lots of parts of the UK that are pleasant when I walk around. I talk to some friends on the phone saying, "Is this really a thing?" You know, we have a no Lotus Eaters over breakfast rule in the house because I just get too wound up. But it's it's great quality content. Don't get me wrong. It's the team's fantastic, but it's I found myself getting irate first thing in the morning when my mood's quite vulnerable at that state to setting up the whole day. So I might put on a bit more of the philosophical content rather than the news content. Just to kind of go, what's the tone of this? And another one I think is comparisons. Now you mentioned sort of women and body image. I think men are catching up with that. um, as someone who sort of thinks and talks for a living, I was watching who was it, Louise Perry earlier today. She's fantastic, and I just remember thinking, I'm just not as smart as this person. This person's better than me. How can I have a grip? How can I interview Josh later? I can't possibly do it. But I went to a little spot. I went, hang on a minute, just take a breath, Mark. It's okay. It's going to be fine. You know, and that's my level. Someone else it might be physical. For someone else it might be financial. Alex Hormozy's richer than me. I need to be rich. And there's an 18-year-old kid looking at that who's obviously got no money because they're 18. So, yeah, any thoughts on comparison and the trap around that?
Of course, it's a way to perpetually make yourself miserable. I have a very Buddhist approach on this of just, the world is the way it is and don't read too much into it. The enemy is desire, not you know, material lack. And obviously that's not to say you shouldn't better yourself, but just the law of mathematics suggests that in everything you dedicate yourself in, the likelihood is that there's going to be someone better than you. So don't get too hung up about it. Getting better is should be its own reward, and look at it that way. Are you enjoying what you're doing? Because of course, one of the problems is that we don't view ourselves objectively necessarily. We assess ourselves based on our peers, and so this is sort of why billionaires compete with one another. It might be, difficult to see. Well, hang on a minute. Why aren't they just comfortable? Why aren't they living a life of luxury or just not expanding anymore? Why have they still got this drive to compete? It's because their peer group has changed, and now they want a bigger yacht or they want to, be more beloved by the public. Who knows? Obviously, I'm not in that group. Please change that if you can.
I know far too many wealthy people. Unfortunately, we had Zuby on the show a while back. I said, "Listen, Zuby, it's okay that you're richer than me, more famous than me, but you're more buff than me too." I said, "Your cheating Nigerian genetics are helping you out there, sir." And he laughed. And it's so easy to compare. It's so easy to compare with the people you know. So yeah. What's next for you, Josh? So, where are you going? I still sometimes see you doing stuff for Lotus Eaters, but your YouTube channel I recommend. People can find out how cats can send you insane. We didn't get to that, but yeah, where are you going? I was kind of looking you up today. Going, what's the next thing for him?
Well, I'm going to stay in the political sphere for a while, but I'm going to try and keep a good balance. I'd be a bit of a hypocrite if I'm recommending that to people and then not doing it myself. So I'm going to. The idea is the YouTube channel continues on in the background, and I continue doing interesting videos about non-political things. The idea is the general philosophy, I suppose I could say, is that I want to make people interested in the world in the same way that I am. It's sort of playing on the notion of when you're in love, you want to tell the world, well, I'm in love with learning about the world, so I want everyone else to feel that same feeling and feel just as inspired to learn about things as I do. And so I'm going to continue that on, hopefully push that into a direction whereby I can make full-length documentaries about things. My end goal is I want to be like a right-wing Vice almost. How back in the day they wanted to,
Yeah,
they made really good
yeah, they
documentaries
did.
and then they stopped doing that so much. But I feel like that's sort of left a vacuum, and I think that there's a good space there to do something very meaningful and to build something there that I don't want necessarily to be political, but just not overtly left wing. Mainly looking at social things and maybe the odd geopolitical thing and what have you. But like something that I had in mind would be going to West Papua, which is a part of Papua New Guinea that was absorbed by or invaded, I suppose is a fairer term, by Indonesia, and looking at the conflict between basically a modern day military and hunter gatherers because that's fundamentally what's going on. That's a very interesting thing, probably a bit dangerous, but not many people are looking at that. Not many people are making documentaries about that. That's the kind of thing that there should be more international attention on. And then on the other side, I've obviously got my political work. I'm doing writing, I'm doing podcasts. I'm trying to get involved in a few other things, which I've been told not to mention yet.
Okay, interesting. I mean,
But
Papua New Guinea versus Swindon. I know which one I'd rather go to, Josh. Like, you
yeah,
know.
Papua New Guinea, yeah.
Got a few jokes there, but probably not for the internet. Okay, yeah. So something you can't talk about as well. So this is your SAS training on the hills, wild camping, something like that.
I'm
Yeah.
a bit too old to join the SAS, I think. I'm turning 30 in November, so
Turning 30, I'm 46. It's so good to see this generation of young guys. I felt like they were raised on Jordan Peterson and then the sort of the Brits and the other people that Saga and other people that came through. And I know it's easy to be down when you look at the news. And for young guys watching this, they're up against it, as we've said, all these psychological factors, discrimination, economic factors. But there's also a lot of positive, isn't there? I mean, like you making your own YouTube channel and putting that stuff up, talking about making documentaries, there's a having podcasts. I get to speak to all these people around the world here, just fantastic people. I mean, there's actually at the same time as being sort of the worst time in human history to be a young man, as well as all the first world benefits of cappuccinos and duvets and things like that. There's also just this massive opportunity. Like when I was a kid, I couldn't have made a documentary. It wouldn't, the technology wasn't there, the opportunity wasn't there. But now that's a thing I could choose to do.
I
So
think in many ways it's the best time to exist because um, one thing I did notice is people of my parents' generation, born either in the late 50s or the 60s, even, early 70s, they didn't have a war or any existential threats. They lived in a very comfortable time. And I think actually they're probably more disproportionately likely to be miserable because
yes,
they feel like they didn't necessarily do anything, they just existed.
right.
Whereas having some sort of struggle, I remember talking to my grandparents about the war because I've got quite an old family, and they never necessarily complained that it happened in their lifetime. They never said, "Oh, I wish it didn't happen." They talk both sets talked about how they were grateful
Yes,
to come back and be alive, and everything took on a new sense of wow, this is amazing. It's similar to living. You survived death, and now you're living on just some extra borrowed time, and so anything extra is, in many ways beautiful. And I think that having this struggle for our civilization in many ways not only habituates people into ways to overcome that struggle and therefore becoming better overall as people, but also gives us a sense of purpose. And I think that this is part of the reason why there's this sort of cyclical view of history emerging, whereby, it's that the hard times create strong men, and strong men create, that cycle. Everyone's seen it.
soft times create influencers. I think that's the end of the cycle. I mean, I'm surrounded by Croatian men and beautiful Croatian women on a daily basis, so I have an existential threat just hanging over me.
I really like Croatia when I was there. It's a
Croatia's
beautiful country,
fantastic.
isn't it?
They're a great mix of friendly and aggressive, and it's very beautiful. We've got a lot of friends. It's a really nice place. The Balkans have that slight existential sense. I wonder if we're getting to that point now, though, in the West, where because here it's very safe. It's very doesn't have a lot of the problems. Though they've just increased the population by 10% with migration, which may end a disaster for them. Let's see, but they're very selective where they took that from. But I wonder if we're getting to that sense of existential threat almost in the West now that might actually bring out the best in people, that might actually have a sense of like, hey, we're up against it here. And perhaps, being optimistic here as we close, but perhaps that could lead to young men actually kind of going, no, there's something deeper that needs to come out, given that.
I think it puts people on a bit of a war footing, and you hear about the sort of war generations and how people rose to the challenge and rose to the hardship. And I think a similar sort of thing's going on now to a certain extent. Certainly, our taxes are comparable to that of wartime taxes, so that's
Yes.
going to have enough effect all on its own. But I think separating the wheat from the chaff is very much going on. And I know it's a bit of an elitist way of looking at things, but I think that people should allow and facilitate the best people being able to grow and flourish and be able to do a disproportionate amount of good for the world, because fundamentally that's what I see good people as doing. Maybe not, the BlackRock investment banks where they're very important people, but sort of evil in many ways, sort of Bond villain types. But innovators and people that are making media that people resonate with and find meaningful. Not only are they finding meaning in their work, but they're also sharing it to a wide number of other people. That's very important, I think, as well as I think that these challenges are going to spur people on and motivate them more. And I think that that can only be a good thing. I think that having something tangible to overcome is much better than simply living for the sake of it and living very comfortably. And it's sort of the notion of, say, returning to the 1990s, or it might seem superficially appealing, I don't think would be good for people, because you need these sorts of things to light a fire in your belly and give you something to wake up and change.
Boom. I'm not listening to Blur again. I'll tell you that, mate. That is a wonderful place to end, Josh. Where do people find you online? Where do people go to be in touch with you?
Sure. I suppose you can find me on X. It's just Josh Ferme. And funnily enough, my YouTube is also Josh Ferme. And if you want to see my work at Lotus Eaters, you can go on their website, lotuseaters.com. And believe it or not, you find my profile and click on it, and it says Josh Ferme. So I've been very imaginative.
Good brand is Ferme, not
Mhm.
like a football firm. So Ferme. Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.